April 11, 1951. Inside the American Embassy in Tokyo, five-star General Douglas MacArthur sits down for a quiet lunch with his family. Suddenly, an aide interrupts with staggering news, intercepted not through classified military channels, but from a commercial radio broadcast. The legendary Supreme Commander has just been stripped of all his commands. He hasn't been defeated on a battlefield. He has been taken down by a typed directive from the Oval Office. This unprecedented dismissal instantly triggers a massive political earthquake. How could the most revered military leader in the nation be unceremoniously fired by his own president? The collision between Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur was never just a clash of massive egos or a simple disagreement over battlefield tactics. It was a fundamental battle over who truly holds the ultimate destructive power of the United States. It put a core constitutional failsafe to its most severe test. Could an elected civilian executive actually rein in a brilliant, fiercely independent, and largely uncontrollable military theater commander during a major war? MacArthur carried an aura of absolute invincibility and commanded a devout public following, making him appear nearly untouchable to the politicians back in Washington. Truman, by contrast, was a blunt, former artillery captain thrust into the highest office, determined to prevent a global nuclear holocaust at all costs. How did a bitter strategic argument over a frozen Asian peninsula escalate into a full-blown crisis that threatened to shatter the bedrock foundation of civilian control over the American military? The answer is not found in the political maneuvering of Washington. The roots of this unprecedented constitutional crisis lay thousands of miles away, born directly from a rapidly deteriorating and increasingly desperate military situation on the ground in Korea. By late November 1950, the United Nations forces in Korea were pushing relentlessly north, approaching the freezing waters of the Yalu River, which formed the border with Communist China. Douglas MacArthur's brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon just weeks earlier had shattered the North Korean army. The Supreme Commander confidently assured Washington and the press that his troops would be home by Christmas. Intelligence reports from his own staff suggesting a massive Chinese military buildup were largely dismissed by his Tokyo headquarters as an elaborate diplomatic bluff. Then the trap snapped shut. Bursting from the snow-covered mountains under the cover of darkness, roughly 300,000 Chinese infantrymen pour into the overextended, freezing American and UN columns. It was one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in United States military history. The UN forces were suddenly fighting for their very survival, forced into a brutal, agonizing retreat down the peninsula in sub-zero temperatures. The seemingly invincible theater commander had just been dealt a staggering, humiliating blow. MacArthur immediately realized that the conflict had mutated into what he famously called an entirely new war. But he was fundamentally unwilling to accept defeat, or even a drawn-out stalemate. To stabilize the collapsing front and secure a total victory, MacArthur concluded that the United States must immediately expand the theater of operations. He demanded authorization to bomb the Chinese supply lines and industrial sanctuaries across the Yalu River in Manchuria. He proposed a total naval blockade of the Chinese coast to strangle their wartime economy. He urged Washington to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan to open a second front on the mainland. Behind closed doors, military planners even evaluated his suggestions of deploying atomic weapons or laying a belt of radioactive cobalt across the Korean neck to sever enemy supply lines indefinitely. For a general who had spent a lifetime studying the mechanics of total victory, the tactical logic was unassailable. If an enemy attacks you from a sanctuary, you must destroy the sanctuary. But 8,000 miles away in Washington, President Harry Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were looking at a terrifyingly different global map. To the civilian leadership and the Pentagon brass, including Secretary of Defense George Marshall and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, Korea was a dangerous distraction. Their primary strategic nightmare was the Soviet Union and the precarious defense of Western Europe. Truman's administration knew that China and the Soviet Union were bound by a mutual defense treaty. They were paralyzed by the very real calculation that bombing Manchuria or blockading the Chinese coast would trigger direct Soviet intervention. If Soviet bombers entered the fray, or if Joseph Stalin decided to use the American distraction in Asia to send Soviet tank armies plunging through the Fulda Gap into West Germany, the local conflict in Korea would instantly detonate World War III, a war that would inevitably escalate into a global nuclear exchange. Faced with the existential threat of atomic annihilation, Truman's administration radically altered the American military objective. They abandoned the goal of unifying a liberated Korea. Instead, they ordered MacArthur to fight a limited war of attrition, bleeding the Chinese and North Korean forces just enough to stabilize the front near the 38th parallel and force a negotiated armistice. To MacArthur, the very concept of a limited war was militarily absurd and morally repulsive. He had been trained that in war there is no substitute for victory. From his headquarters at the Daiichi building in Tokyo, he watched his men fighting, freezing, and dying in the Korean mud, while being explicitly forbidden by politicians to strike the enemy's true source of power. He viewed Washington's strategy of restraint not as a prudent geopolitical calculation, but as a cowardly surrender. The disconnect between the battlefield commander and the commander-in-chief swiftly degenerated from a strategic disagreement into a toxic breakdown in communication. The Joint Chiefs in the Pentagon sent directives urging caution. MacArthur interpreted them with maximum flexibility, frequently pushing the boundaries of his orders to the absolute breaking point. He grew increasingly convinced that the diplomats and bureaucrats in the Truman administration were appeasers, blind to the true immediate threat of global communism in Asia. MacArthur believed that the destiny of the free world was being decided on the Asian continent right then and there, not in a hypothetical European war, and that the civilian leadership lacked the stomach to win it. As the bitter winter of 1950 bled into the spring of 1951, the pressure cooker of this strategic deadlock reached critical mass. Trapped in a bloody war of attrition he was forbidden to win, and fundamentally alienated from the strategic realities gripping the Oval Office, the Supreme Commander reached a dangerous conclusion. Believing that the political leadership in Washington was actively betraying the troops bleeding on the ground, MacArthur decided he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. By late March 1951, the bloody pendulum of the Korean War had swung back. The newly revitalized Eighth Army had clawed its way northward, recapturing Seoul and stabilizing the front lines near the 38th parallel. Inside the Oval Office, President Truman and the State Department recognized a fleeting window of opportunity. The administration began meticulously drafting a presidential peace initiative. The plan was to publicly offer Beijing and Pyongyang a ceasefire, signaling that the United States was ready to halt the bloodshed and negotiate a settlement without expanding the conflict. It was a delicate maneuver requiring absolute coordination. The Joint Chiefs forwarded the draft proposal to Tokyo, simply to keep their theater commander informed of the impending announcement. They fatally underestimated MacArthur's willingness to cross the line. On March 24th, mere days before Truman was scheduled to broadcast his offer, the Supreme Commander launched a preemptive strike of his own, not with artillery, but with a microphone. Bypassing the White House and the Pentagon, MacArthur issued a blistering official communiqué directly to the global press. In the statement, he openly mocked China's lack of industrial capacity, declaring they lacked the means to conduct modern warfare. But then he crossed a constitutional Rubicon. MacArthur issued his own public ultimatum to Beijing. He explicitly threatened that if the United Nations decided to expand military operations to Chinese coastal areas and interior bases, it would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse. The diplomatic fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. In a matter of hours, a carefully constructed presidential peace initiative vaporized. International allies recoiled in horror, terrified that the American theater commander was unilaterally declaring World War III. In Beijing, Beijing, the communist leadership did not view the statement as the rogue opinion of a frustrated general. They read it as an unyielding American threat of total war, immediately rejecting any notion of a ceasefire. Inside the White House, the atmosphere turned to ice. Harry Truman realized with chilling clarity that his top general was now effectively running a rogue foreign policy. MacArthur had not just disagreed with his commander-in-chief, he had actively sabotaged the diplomatic strategy of the United States government on the world stage. For the president, this blatant public act of insubordination proved the two men could no longer coexist. A decisive confrontation was now completely unavoidable, but the final, fatal stroke that would shatter MacArthur's career was still days away. The fatal blow to the Supreme Commander's career finally arrived not from the frozen battlefields of the Korean Peninsula, but from the floor of the United States House of Representatives. On the afternoon of April 5, 1951, House Minority Leader Joseph Martin stepped to the podium in the Capitol building. Martin was a fiercely partisan Republican, a relentless critic of the Truman administration's foreign policy, and a staunch advocate for a more aggressive military posture in Asia. Weeks earlier, on March 8th, Martin had written a personal letter to General Douglas MacArthur in Tokyo. In it, the congressman heavily criticized the administration's strategy of limited war and specifically solicited the general's views on a highly controversial proposal, utilizing hundreds of thousands of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese troops, currently exiled on the island of Formosa, to open a second front against communist forces on the Asian mainland. MacArthur had drafted his reply on March 20th. Technically, it was private correspondence between a theater commander and an elected official. In reality, it was a loaded political weapon handed directly to the leader of the political opposition. Standing before his colleagues, Congressman Martin read MacArthur's words straight into the congressional record. Of the general's letter explicitly endorsed Martin's aggressive views, openly validating the deployment of nationalist Chinese forces, a move the Truman administration and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had repeatedly and categorically rejected for fear of triggering a massive expansion of the war. But the letter went much further than tactical disagreements. MacArthur openly attacked the administration's fundamental geopolitical strategy, which prioritized the defense of Western Europe over the conflict in Asia. The general wrote that it seemed strangely difficult for some in Washington to realize that Asia was where the communist conspirators had elected to make their play for global conquest. He declared that if the United States lost the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe was inevitable. And then Martin read the closing sentence of the letter, a phrase that would instantly immortalize the rift and electrify the nation. There is no substitute for victory. The reading of the Martin letter sent immediate seismic shockwaves through the Capitol and across the globe. This was no longer a matter of classified tactical disagreements taking place over encrypted military teletypes. A five-star theater commander was actively using a partisan political leader to publicly lobby against the foreign policy of his own commander-in-chief. It was a direct, undeniable challenge to the constitutional authority of the presidency, broadcast for the entire world to hear. For Harry Truman, the Martin letter was the absolute breaking point. The president knew immediately, with chilling certainty, that Douglas MacArthur had to go. But firing a living military legend, a man who had triumphantly accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, a man who currently governed the rebuilt nation of Japan as a virtual viceroy, could not be a unilateral emotional reaction. It had to be an ironclad institutional decision. Truman understood that dismissing an officer of MacArthur's immense stature would ignite a political firestorm that could consume his presidency. If the dismissal appeared to be a purely partisan political hit, it would tear the country apart. On Friday morning, April 6th, the day after the Martin letter was made public, Truman convened a highly secretive meeting in his Oval Office. He gathered his four most trusted national security advisors, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Omar Bradley, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and Special Assistant W. Averill Harriman. Truman did not immediately declare his intentions to fire the general. Instead, he methodically laid out the situation and asked each man for his unfiltered counsel. He needed to ensure that the civilian and military leadership were completely aligned. The civilians in the room did not hesitate. Harriman argued for immediate dismissal, viewing MacArthur's insubordination as an intolerable breach of executive authority that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Atchison agreed, pointing out that MacArthur's rogue public statements were terrifying America's European allies, destroying the cohesion of the newly formed NATO alliance, and making it impossible for the State Department to negotiate a diplomatic settlement. But Atchison, an astute political observer, also issued a stark warning to the president, noting that relieving MacArthur would trigger the biggest and most vicious political fight of the administration. The military men, however, hesitated. General George Marshall, the revered architect of the Allied victory in World War II and a man of unassailable integrity, deeply understood the immense political and psychological gravity of firing MacArthur. He cautioned against a hasty decision and asked the president for time to thoroughly review the official message traffic between Washington and Tokyo. Over the weekend, Marshall retreated to his quarters and methodically read through months of classified cables, strategic directives, and MacArthur's increasingly defiant responses. By Saturday morning, Marshall returned to the White House, his mind entirely made up. He looked at Truman and stated that after reviewing the documentary evidence, MacArthur should have been fired 2 years ago. The chronic insubordination was undeniable, and the chain of command was fundamentally broken. The institutional responsibility then shifted to General Omar Bradley and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On Sunday afternoon, April 8th, Bradley convened a tense, closed-door session with the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in a secure room deep inside the Pentagon. They deliberately stripped away the toxic politics of Washington and analyzed the crisis purely through the rigid lens of military command structure. They reviewed MacArthur's demands to bomb Manchuria and blockade China. They recognized that while MacArthur believed expanding the war was the only way to achieve victory, doing so would fundamentally weaken the United States' global strategic position, draining critical resources away from the defense of Europe. As Bradley would later famously articulate, expanding the conflict into China would involve the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. But their final conclusion did not hinge on battlefield strategy. It hinged on control. The Joint Chiefs concluded that MacArthur was not being dismissed because his military strategy in Korea was inherently flawed, but because his reckless actions were actively jeopardizing the global chain of command. A theater commander who refused to coordinate his public statements with the national strategy, who routinely bypassed his superiors, and who actively campaigned against the commander-in-chief's policies was a catastrophic liability in a nuclear age. The Joint Chiefs voted unanimously to recommend MacArthur's relief from command. On Monday, April 9th, they formally reported their decision to the president. The institutional wall had been built. The military establishment had officially and firmly sided with the civilian leadership. While Washington agonizingly debated the constitutional limits of military power behind closed doors, the enemy was watching closely. Across the globe, in Beijing and Moscow, Chinese and Soviet intelligence networks were meticulously tracking the public fracturing of the American high command. They did not need deeply embedded spies to uncover this crisis. It was playing out on the front pages of Western newspapers and echoing through international radio broadcasts. For Mao Zedong and his supreme field commander, General Peng Dehuai, the political chaos engulfing Washington and Tokyo was not merely a diplomatic curiosity. It was a highly exploitable, critical strategic vulnerability. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had suffered horrific casualties during the brutal winter fighting and their subsequent retreat northward. Their supply lines had been devastated by relentless American air power, and their frontline units were exhausted and severely depleted. But the internal friction paralyzing the American command structure provided a crucial window of opportunity. Viewing the deeply divided American leadership as hesitant, distracted, and disjointed, Chinese forces utilized the political deadlock to aggressively rebuild their combat power. Moving silently at night through the treacherous, thawing mountain passes of the Korean peninsula to avoid American aerial reconnaissance, Peng Dehuai began amassing a staggering force of over 300,000 fresh infantrymen, backed by newly acquired Soviet artillery. Soviet intelligence, operating in the shadows, monitored the American hesitation, confirming that the Truman administration was terrified of escalating the war and desperate to avoid a global confrontation. This strategic dissonance emboldened the communist planners. They calculated that a sudden, massive shock to the United Nations lines could completely shatter the political will of an already deeply divided American government. As the civilian and military leaders in Washington finalized their bureaucratic plans to remove their supreme commander, the Chinese were finalizing the lethal logistics for their massive spring offensive, known as the Fifth Phase Offensive, designed to completely annihilate the United States Eighth Army and drive them violently into the sea. The clock was ticking on the battlefield, completely indifferent to the constitutional crisis unfolding in the Oval Office. By Monday, April 9th, the final decision in Washington was cemented. Harry Truman officially ordered the drafting of the dismissal papers. What followed was a frantic, unprecedented scramble inside the White House to execute the firing of an American military icon under conditions of absolute, airtight secrecy. The stakes of this bureaucratic operation were incredibly precarious. MacArthur possessed a massive, fiercely loyal public following and deeply entrenched, powerful political allies in Congress. If the general received even the slightest advance warning of his termination, he could easily orchestrate a preemptive resignation. By resigning before he could be fired, MacArthur would frame himself as a political martyr, forced out by a weak, appeasing administration that was soft on communism. This would not only humiliate the president, but could fatally undermine public support for the ongoing war effort and trigger a catastrophic political revolt. To prevent a preemptive strike, the drafting of the official orders bypassed standard White House clerical channels entirely. The documents were meticulously typed and handled by a tightly restricted circle of top aides working behind locked doors. The language drafted was cold, formal, and legally unambiguous. General Douglas MacArthur was to be relieved of his 4 immense hats: Supreme Commander, Allied Powers; Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command; Commander-in-Chief, Far East; and Commanding General, United States Army, Far East. Absolute command would be transferred immediately to General Matthew Ridgway, the commander of the Eighth Army in Korea. But the central, agonizing problem remained: how to deliver the fatal blow across 8,000 miles and multiple time zones without the global press finding out. The administration devised a careful, highly respectful protocol. Frank Pace, the Secretary of the Army, was currently on a tour of the combat zones in Korea. The plan was to transmit the dismissal orders through highly secure encrypted military channels to John Muccio, the American ambassador in South Korea. Muccio was instructed to physically locate Secretary Pace at the front. Once Pace had the orders in hand, he was to commandeer a military aircraft, fly directly to Tokyo, and request a private audience at the Daiichi building. There, the Secretary of the Army would personally and privately present the termination orders to MacArthur. It was a meticulously engineered procedure designed specifically to preserve the dignity of the 5-star general and protect the institutional authority of the presidency. The White House had choreographed a quiet, controlled demolition of MacArthur's career, ensuring the monumental transition of power would occur safely behind closed doors, long before the public, the press, or the general's political allies could react. But this delicate timeline relied entirely on the absolute, flawless containment of information. In the volatile, highly charged atmosphere of Washington politics, secrets were nearly impossible to hold. The administration had a perfect, airtight plan for a respectful dismissal, but a single, sudden leak would instantly turn a carefully managed command transition into a catastrophic public disaster. The meticulously engineered plan disintegrated before Secretary Pace ever received his encrypted orders. Late on the evening of April 10th, a massive leak shattered the administration's firewall. A reporter for the fiercely anti-Truman Chicago Tribune had obtained the story of the impending dismissal and was preparing to publish. Inside the White House, panic set in. If the Tribune broke the news first, MacArthur's political allies would instantly hijack the narrative, framing the firing as a partisan ambush before the president could issue the official directive. The administration had to beat the morning papers. Truman's press secretary, Joseph Short, scrambled into action. At 1 a.m. on April 11th, Short convened a hasty, unprecedented midnight press conference. Bleary-eyed reporters, summoned from their beds, were handed the stark, typed statements announcing the relief of the Supreme Commander. The news flashed across international wire services instantly. Because of this frantic scramble, the official military notification channels were entirely outpaced by the press. In Tokyo, it was midday. Douglas MacArthur, a five-star general who had commanded millions and reshaped the Pacific, did not receive a private, dignified briefing from the Secretary of the Army. Instead, he suffered the ultimate institutional humiliation, learning of his sudden termination from a standard news bulletin playing over a commercial radio broadcast. This procedural blunder transformed a necessary, agonizing command decision into an unmitigated public relations disaster. The backlash was instantaneous and visceral. President Truman's public approval ratings entered a catastrophic freefall, plummeting to a staggering 22%. MacArthur, returning to the United States for the first time in 14 years, did not arrive in disgrace. He was welcomed as an exiled political martyr. Over 7 million people flooded the streets of New York City for a blinding, euphoric ticker tape parade, showering the defiant general in adulation. Truman had successfully preserved the constitutional authority of the presidency, but in doing so, he had ignited a domestic firestorm. The true battle would now move from the frozen combat zones of Korea directly to Capitol Hill, where the nation itself would decide who was right. The constitutional crisis reached its absolute boiling point in early May 1951, inside the cavernous, packed hearing rooms of the United States Senate. The Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees convened joint hearings to investigate the firing, but the proceedings quickly morphed into a profound trial over the military strategy of the Republic. For 3 consecutive days, Douglas MacArthur commanded the witness chair, delivering a mesmerizing, emotionally charged defense of his aggressive operational vision. Speaking with the booming authority of a living legend, he insisted that once combat is joined, military commanders in the field must never be handcuffed by the hesitant political calculations of Washington diplomats. He framed the administration's strategy of limited war not merely as a tactical mistake, but as a moral betrayal of the soldiers bleeding in Korea. To MacArthur, appeasing communist aggression in Asia guaranteed the eventual collapse of the free world. His commanding performance captivated a deeply divided nation, threatening to legitimize his insubordination and making the Truman administration appear dangerously weak. To counter this overwhelming public tide, the administration realized they could not deploy a politician to argue against a five-star general. They needed a witness with unimpeachable battlefield credentials to systematically dismantle MacArthur's argument. They called upon General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When Bradley took the oath, the atmosphere in the hearing room shifted abruptly from theatrical defiance to grim, clinical reality. Unlike MacArthur's soaring philosophical rhetoric, Bradley's testimony was methodical, completely stripped of emotion, and rooted entirely in global logistics and the terrifying calculus of the atomic age. Under sworn oath, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs delivered the fatal counterblow. He systematically explained to the senators that the Soviet Union, not Red China, remained the ultimate strategic threat to American survival. Expanding the Korean conflict by bombing Manchuria or blockading the Chinese coast would not secure a quick victory. It would drain critical resources from the defense of Western Europe and risk triggering a massive Soviet retaliation. Then, Bradley leaned into the microphone and delivered a devastating single sentence that instantly neutralized MacArthur's entire strategic premise. He testified that extending the conflict into mainland China would involve the United States in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. Bradley's cold, unassailable logic pierced straight through the emotional hysteria gripping the Capitol. He expertly reframed the debate, forcing the Senate and the American public to look past the intoxicating charisma of a rebellious hero and confront the terrifying, practical reality of detonating World War III. Bradley's testimony acted as a slow but deliberate pressure valve, releasing the intense national hysteria that had followed MacArthur's firing. The exhaustive Senate hearings, dragging on for weeks, meticulously dismantled the general's aura of invincibility. Under the relentless weight of global logistics and nuclear arithmetic presented by the Joint Chiefs, the public narrative began to shift. The focus moved away from the emotional betrayal of a military hero and settled firmly on the cold, inescapable logic of global survival in the atomic age. This confrontation, painful and deeply divisive, ultimately proved that the constitutional firewall held under extreme pressure. It clarified, with brutal finality, the operational boundaries of the American system. Civilian leadership must dictate the political objectives of a conflict, while the military remains strictly the instrument used to achieve them. A theater commander, regardless of his brilliance or popularity, cannot unilaterally override the foreign policy of the elected government. Harry Truman paid a devastating political price to enforce this boundary. He essentially sacrificed his own presidency, accepting historically low approval ratings and immense public scorn to ensure that the ultimate destructive power of the United States remained firmly under civilian control. The immediate political disaster of MacArthur's dismissal secured a vital long-term principle, though. It established a precedent that would guide American command structure through the ensuing decades of the Cold War, ensuring that, in an era where conflicts could escalate to global annihilation, the final decision would always rest with a president, not a general. Douglas MacArthur ultimately faded away, just as the old soldier famously predicted he would during his dramatic farewell address to Congress, ending a legendary career not in battlefield triumph, but in sudden administrative exile. Yet, while Harry Truman's deeply unpopular signature on a simple piece of paper effectively destroyed his own political future, it secured a critical precedent for the survival of the modern world. That single, defiant stroke of a pen ensured that elected civilians and not untouchable generals would forever hold the absolute keys to the American nuclear arsenal.